My Lords, it's a great pleasure to follow the Noble Lord Kerr of Kinlochard and to reassure him, or perhaps apologise to him, that this time I'm not intending to tweet out a video of his speech. But that is not a reflection of the lack of importance of today's debate. This is crucial, as the Noble Lady Baroness Armstrong of Hilltop said, to the well-being of all Britons, but particularly perhaps those in some of the poorer areas of the country, often subjected to the government's levelling up rhetoric. And I think it's worthwhile going back a year. If we look back to the ratification of the TCA by Parliament a year ago, and the Institute for Government then criticised a measly one day allocated to scrutinising the agreement. We saw also the Institute for Government noting the short time between ratification and implementation, how difficult it made it for firms, very particularly for small firms. To quote the Institute of Directors, they said on the guidance there were reams of it coming quite late in the day. So I think it's worth thinking about a year on, how much better off are we? And you think about the fact that we are now in this rather small chamber with an extremely distinguished panel participating in this debate, but it's not perhaps the centre of the attention of the House, let alone the country. And yet, scrutinising what's happening is absolutely crucial. And there's an enormous amount of detail here. I'm just going to pick out some points from each one of these three reports. And I think on all of them, when we look at the government's responses, which is what I'll focus on, they often stray towards the perfunctory, and some phrases such as world-leading that we're all too sadly familiar with. And I note, and I pick out the same point as the Noble Lord Kerr did in the response to the report on the institutional framework, so formidably introduced by the Noble Earl of Kinnoul. The government says, "We are confident there will be the necessary regular political level engagement, both with the EU institutions and bilaterally with the member states at all levels." So, a direct question to the Noble Lord the Minister. Is he pleased? Is that the adjective he would use? Or what adjective would he use to describe the contents, the volume and the results of contact with both EU institutions and bilaterally with ministers and officials in EU states? Moving on to the Trade in Services report, and I think the Noble Lady Baroness Donaghy talked about minor acts of mitigation to many of the issues that it covers. I'm just going to pick up two areas of these that have been of particular interest that I've pursued very much over the past year. One about creative industries and the other about a loss of Erasmus Plus and the inadequacy of the replacement of the touring scheme. And I note again in the government's response and the issues around haulage and cabotage that have been so crucial, and carnets, that the government says the Department of Transport is looking at possible steps to support UK specialist hauliers. Now, of course, as many noble lords have noted, COVID has been an additional massive barrier and indeed has somewhat frozen the whole situation. We hope, at least, that we're coming to the point of this being unfrozen. So I wonder what steps the government is planning to take to support particularly hauliers as well as the creative industries more generally. And I note again that the government response says it's important that businesses and individuals confirm processes in advance of their journey. And I really do think that sentence in the government response stresses the difficulties faced by the creative sector, both artists and those businesses that work to support those artists. And in terms of the touring scheme, I think the government's response again talks about how touring is only for outward mobility and talks about relationships with individual institutions. A number of them are mentioned: Heidelberg University in Germany, Sorbonne in France, and many other institutions across the Commonwealth. Would the Noble Lord the Minister acknowledge that the universities, who've had so much pressures under the age of COVID as well, are facing enormous pressures if they have to build up one-to-one relationships, and is the government working to make that easier? And finally, I come on to the trade in goods, and I think here the government response again talks about the difficulties, as the committee did, of small and medium enterprises. And I particularly want to point the Noble Lord the Minister to the report from the Federation of Small Business, which notes that only a quarter, and this is a report out just a few days ago, notes only a quarter of small companies believe they're ready for the new border checks that are coming in January, in which they will have to include import customs declarations for EU goods, have to make those declarations and pay those relevant tariffs at the point of imports. And particularly when we come to, as a number of other noble lords have pointed to, food, drinks and products of animal origin, that they will have to give notice in advance. So can the Noble Lord the Minister tell me if he's confident that we will be ready for this yet further change? And I just want to conclude very briefly with some reflections on the position of trade in general. And I come to this debate with a different position from most other noble lords, because I don't go, yay, trade, more trade, more trade, more trade. What I'm interested in is the well-being of the people of the UK, the well-being of the people of the planet, and the well-being of the planet. And we are in a situation where the government often seems to be trying to push trade with other parts of the world, support free trade agreements, something that's a very great concern, particularly to our farmers, at great cost to the environment, at great cost to existing businesses. And I think we're in a situation where in New Zealand it's looking to operate through the Living Standards framework in all of its decisions by its Treasury and its other bodies. In the other place, the Green MP, Caroline Lucas, had a debate last week talking about a well-being economy. So I wonder if the Noble Lord, the Minister, has given thought to the idea of well-being trade, trade that's not a win for us at the cost of someone else, but a benefit to people operating within the physical limits of this one fragile planet.